The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises, and Marcus Webb sat in the second row with his daughter's hand clutched in his, both of them watching a man's life unravel in real time. Judge Richard Bannister presided from his bench with the kind of smug authority that came from 20 years of never being challenged. His robes pressed sharp, his gray hair perfectly combed, his reputation spotless. The custody hearing had been brutal. Marcus had watched the single father on the stand get torn apart by his ex-wife's lawyer, watched him struggle to explain why he'd been late to 3 parent-teacher conferences, why his work schedule was unpredictable, why sometimes he looked exhausted. The man's name was David Torres, and he was fighting like hell to keep his son. But the judge's expression said he'd already made up his mind. Then Bannister did something that would haunt him forever. "Mr. Torres, I see here you served in the military," the judge said, glancing at his papers with theatrical boredom. "What were you, some kind of helicopter pilot?" David straightened slightly, and Marcus saw something flicker across his face. Pride mixed with pain, the kind that comes from carrying memories most people couldn't imagine. "Yes, Your Honor. I flew Apaches in Afghanistan." Bannister chuckled, actually chuckled, and leaned back in his chair like he was about to deliver the punchline to a joke only he understood. "Well then, humor me. Did you boys have those cute little call signs like in the movies? What was yours, Maverick?" The courtroom went silent, and Marcus felt his daughter's hand tighten around his. What happened in that moment would make national news within 48 hours. David's jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Shadowhawk, sir." The judge snorted, actually snorted, and Marcus saw several people in the gallery stiffen. "Shadowhawk? How very dramatic." Bannister waved his hand dismissively. "Mr. Torres, your service is noted, but frankly, being a weekend warrior doesn't excuse you from being a present father. Your work history shows instability. Your income is inconsistent. And quite honestly, I question whether a man who spent his 20s playing soldier is equipped to provide the stable environment your son needs." The words hung in the air like poison, and Marcus watched David's face go completely blank. The kind of blank that comes right before something breaks. But David didn't break. He sat there, perfectly still, while his lawyer jumped up, objecting, and the ex-wife's attorney tried to hide a smile. That's when Marcus Webb stood up. "Your Honor, I need to say something." Bannister's head snapped toward him, irritation flashing across his features. "Sir, sit down. You're not a party to these proceedings." But Marcus didn't sit down, and his voice carried the weight of every moment he'd kept silent in his life. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm here for my own custody hearing later today. But I was a forward observer in Helmand Province, 2011, and I need you to know something about Shadowhawk." The judge's face reddened. "Mr. Webb, I will hold you in contempt." Marcus cut him off, his words coming faster now, urgency bleeding through. "On November 3, 2011, my unit was pinned down by Taliban fighters in a valley with no cover. We had 16 men, half of them wounded, and we were going to die there. Command said extract was impossible. The LZ was too hot, the terrain too dangerous. Then we heard rotors." The courtroom was dead silent now, everyone frozen, and Marcus saw David close his eyes like he was being dragged back to a place he'd worked years to forget. "Shadowhawk came in anyway," Marcus continued, and his voice cracked. "He flew his Apache through a canyon that Aviation Command later said was physically impossible to navigate, taking fire from 3 sides, and he held position in a hover for 7 minutes. 7 minutes. While we loaded wounded onto a Chinook that came in behind him. His co-pilot took shrapnel to the arm. His aircraft got hit 12 times, and he never flinched. 16 men walked out of that valley because of him. 16 men got to come home to their families, Your Honor. I got to meet my daughter because of him." Marcus looked at his little girl, who was crying now, then back at the judge. So when you call him a weekend warrior who was playing soldier, you need to understand that man saved my life and 15 others. And if he's even a fraction as committed to his son as he was to us that day, that kid is the luckiest child in this courtroom. The silence that followed was suffocating. Judge Bannister's face had gone from red to pale, and Marcus could see the man's hands trembling slightly as he gripped his gavel. David Torres sat motionless, tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. Then another voice spoke up, an older man in the back row wearing a Purple Heart cap. Shadowhawk got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission, he said quietly. I was one of the wounded, lost my leg that day, but I lived long enough to walk my daughter down the aisle because of him. Then another person stood, and another. And Marcus realized with shock that at least 6 people in that courtroom gallery had been there, had come to support David without him even knowing. Brothers and sisters in arms who'd tracked down his hearing and shown up. One woman held up her phone, already recording, and said clearly, "This is going on every social media platform I have. The public should know how Judge Bannister talks about decorated combat veterans." The judge's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. This hearing is in recess," Bannister stammered, banging his gavel with hands that had lost all authority. But it was too late. The video went viral within hours, 6 million views by evening, news trucks outside the courthouse by midnight. The State Judicial Review Board launched an investigation into Bannister's conduct by the end of the week. David's ex-wife's lawyer quietly withdrew their custody challenge after her client realized being associated with the judge's comments was destroying her own reputation. But none of that was the part that stuck with Marcus. What he remembered was the moment right after, when David had walked over to him in the hallway, unable to speak, and just pulled him into a hug while both of them shook with everything they'd carried for too long. "You didn't have to do that," David finally whispered. Marcus pulled back, looked him in the eye, and said, "Yeah, I did. You flew into hell for me once. Least I could do was speak up in a courtroom." That's when David's son, a skinny 8-year-old who'd been waiting with a court advocate, ran over and wrapped his arms around his father's waist, and Marcus saw what he'd really been fighting for all along. Judge Richard Bannister resigned 6 weeks later under pressure. His career in ruins, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about respecting those who serve. David Torres got full custody, started a non-profit helping veteran parents navigate family court, and never forgot the man who stood up when it mattered most. Marcus Webb won his own custody case, and his daughter grew up knowing her father was the kind of man who did the right thing even when it was hard. They all stayed in touch. The guys from the valley, the ones who'd been there that day and showed up in the courtroom, bound by something deeper than friendship. On Veterans Day, 3 years later, they gathered at David's house for a barbecue, kids running around the yard, laughter replacing the echo of rotors and gunfire that used to fill their dreams. David raised a beer toward Marcus and said simply, "To speaking up." Marcus clinked his bottle against it, watching his daughter play with David's son, and replied, "To flying in anyway." Because some bonds aren't forged in good times, they're hammered out in valleys and courtrooms, in moments when someone has to decide whether silence is easier than truth. And sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to sit down for the whole world to change.